Okay, hey guys, I'm really excited to be chatting with Philip Yancey today. If you are not familiar with him, he is a very beloved author. I have been a fan of his books for many, many years. He has a new memoir out called Where the Light Fell. Philip, thanks so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure, Kristen.
Well, I sincerely enjoyed this book, and as I said, I've read many of your books, but this was such a personal book, and I felt like I was getting to know you, and your whole life story. How did writing this one feel different than other books you've written? I would imagine this felt a little more personal.
It was very personal. I usually go away to a cabin in the mountains when I do my writing. And I got to tell you, Kristen, my wife was pretty worried at points because she knew I was going to write about, some very painful things from the past. And she
Yeah.
thought I would come back kind of limping and wounded. And actually, the opposite happened. I did deal with those difficult times, but writing gives you a way to put perspective on them. And it felt therapeutic for me, actually, just to kind
Hmm.
of get it out, put it on paper, try to find some threads
Yeah.
of where the redemption came from.
Yeah.
Because as I look back on my life, although there are a lot of things that I wish happened in a different way, I can truly say that nothing was wasted, that
Mm.
everything that happened served a purpose. It helped form the person I am now. And I really don't have any deep regrets.
Hmm.
My brother would have a different story, and
Yeah.
I think you and I both probably came from a pretty conservative religious environment. I know I
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
And when you emerge from that, as I look back and wasn't really oppressed by it anymore, I could see that it taught me some important things. It taught me a lot
Hmm.
about the Bible. It taught me habits of discipline. It taught me compassion, justice issues, some of those things.
Hmm.
The problem is not everybody survives. Not everybody
Yeah.
gets through that sorting process of what to keep and what to throw out.
Yeah.
My brother was one of those people.
Yeah. Yeah, your story of your brother and just the pain, both physical and emotional, that he experienced as a result of some of the, the fear based and the um just having questions, or diving outside a little bit of a prescribed path, and just the pain that that caused him. It was very profound to read.
Hmm. Yes, there is a cost. And in a sense, the closer we come to thinking we have the right answers, the more dangerous we can be.
Yeah.
We're talking right now as Afghanistan is falling apart,
Hmm.
and a regime is taking over where they think they have everything
Hmm.
so true that they can
Yeah.
control other people's behavior and even their life or death.
Yeah.
And that's the danger when we start thinking we are God, we're
Yeah.
taking the place of God. And I had encounters with that and did survive, but not everybody does.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I appreciated so much about this book, along those lines, is that I feel that you took a very unflinching look at the church.
Mm.
It was a very honest account, and I thought you actually did it with a ton of grace. But you were factual, and you talked about hard things, and I appreciated that it was coming from inside the room, so to speak. That you are
Mm.
still an author that I knew of growing up, that I read growing up, and I just really appreciated, and it meant a lot to me to have someone that I always saw as a faith leader, talk really openly and honestly, in particular about race, but also just about some of the toxic spiritualese and the fear, and it just I really appreciated you specifically talking
Mm.
so openly about this. You talked about the revivals that you went to growing up, and how there would be that week of very intense. Usually a new speaker would come in, and it would be really intense, but it was also really fear based. And I remember growing up, and we had those same revivals at my church, and it
Mm.
just being like you left that week feeling beaten up, and like you needed to
Right,
get your act together.
right. It's true. I'm glad you mentioned that word fear based because when I looked back, I'm now over 70 years old, and I see that so much of the tribe I grew out of although it had many good things, that
Mm-hmm.
evangelical slash fundamentalist, and mine was
Mm-hmm.
kind of on the fundamentalist side.
Mm-hmm.
It was fear based at the core. We were
Mm-hmm.
always afraid of something.
Yeah.
We were afraid, what if America elects a Catholic president? That was a
Yeah.
big fear
Yeah.
back
I
then.
remember that. Yeah.
And fearing the end of the world and
Mm-hmm.
Armageddon and
Yeah.
communism and secular humanism and HIV AIDS
Mm-hmm.
and transgender, there's
Mm-hmm.
always something to fear.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at the New Testament, I look at Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
who had good reason for fear. He was never fearful,
Mm-hmm.
even when he was on trial, knowing what was going to happen. And there's that verse. I wish we would remember more strongly that verse that says, "Perfect love casts out fear." And if
Mm-hmm.
we're going around being afraid of the environment around us, the people around us, the government, whatever, vaccines,
Yeah.
if that's what defines us,
Mm-hmm.
then we're not experiencing God's perfect love that He wants us to.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a lesson that we need to learn, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it is sad to see that I think, some of the church still coalesces around fear,
Mm-hmm.
and we've now married that fear into political fear, so it's both and, we're fearful of things becoming secular, but then we're also fearful of, losing our freedoms or,
Right.
it just seems like I see a lot of Christians using fear as a way to almost bond. It's this weird sort of dysfunctional bond of like, these are the things we're scared of. I saw a trailer the other day for a new Christian movie, and it was like, it almost looked like a horror movie trailer, and it was the fear was that, the kids are going to be taught about sex in public school, and so let's
Oh
pull them
boy.
all out. God forbid they learn about that. But what do I'm always curious. My background is in psychology. Like, what do you think is the psychology of us leaning towards fear instead of leaning towards the grace, the love, the comfort that's really in the Bible? It's a loaded
I think
question.
I think yeah, we in America are kind of the outlier.
Uh-huh.
In much of the world, Christians are a beleaguered minority, and
Hmm.
they have true reason to fear.
Yeah.
I've been among Christians in India and places like that where they are actively discriminated against and sometimes even physically persecuted.
Hmm.
And in communist China, I remember meeting with some of the folks in the underground church in
Hmm.
communist China, and they told me that they never pray, "Lord, take this government that opposes us away." They
Hmm.
say, "Help us to bear the burdens that are put upon us."
Hmm.
They expect to be the minority. In the United States, we had it kind of nice for a long time. It was a WASP environment. It was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant environment, and that's changed a lot even in my lifetime.
Hmm.
And I heard someone say the other day, we went from being the home team to the visiting team, we Christians, so that we're not the default. We're
Hmm.
we're becoming
Yeah.
the minority.
Yeah.
And if you've been the majority, and if you've had certain privileges, and suddenly you're not anymore,
Yeah.
that's scary, and it's easy to
Hmm.
be angry and resentful, which some Christians are.
Yeah.
But that's not. It make when you're angry and resentful, it's very hard to present your faith as good news.
Right.
And when I go
Right.
around and ask people, what is a Christian? They very often don't come up with good news words. They come up
Hmm.
with bad news words.
Hmm. What we're against.
Exactly.
Yeah. Hmm.
Anti. Yeah. And you mentioned earlier about being honest about the church. And I've actually written other books dealing with that. I wrote one called Church, Why Bother? That puts it
Hmm.
right out there. And one called Soul Survivor,
Yeah.
how my faith survived the church.
Yeah.
And people say, well, why are you picking on the church? I thought you were one of us. And I am.
Yeah.
But I don't know of a more honest book in the world than the Bible,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
takes its greatest heroes and exposes all their flaws. People
Yeah.
like Moses and David and Peter and even Paul, the greatest missionary of all time. He was a human rights abuser. He was a persecutor. He was a
Hmm.
torturer.
Hmm.
And it's as if God has a sense of humor. And he says, I'll show you what I can do. I'll take the
Yeah.
least likely people and do my work through them.
Yeah. Yeah, I get asked that question quite a bit too. Why do I pick on the church? And I find that to be such an interest. I think that says a lot about the asker, because
Yeah.
I feel like when we care about something a lot, we want it to be better, right? I mean,
Mm.
you could say that I pick on my kids and that I'm constantly pushing them to be better. And
Right.
if I see one of them, I mean, I just had a hard conversation with one of my teenagers this week. Like, I don't think you're being kind. Like, I'm
Mm.
observing something, and it's not that I'm not doing it because I don't love them. I'm doing it because I love them,
Because you
right?
do. Right.
Yeah, and it's like I think, especially for those of us that grew up rooted in the church, we desperately want it to be better,
Mm.
right?
I was in a difficult conversation with a person I respect a lot, and he said, "Why are you so critical?"
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of fumbled around for an answer. And I said, "Well, you know the flaws of the church. You know the people who do things wrong that we need to face into." He said, "Well, yeah, I do, but I'd never write about them." And I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Because I believe in the golden rule that we should do unto others as you would have them do unto you." And in a moment of inspiration, I thought, "Hey, that's exactly why I do write about them. Because if I'm off, if my doctrine is off, if I'm not living up to my beliefs, if there's
Mm-hmm.
something about it, I would want them as my neighbor to point it out to me.
Yeah,
That's what I want."
yeah,
Just just as you said with your children,
yeah.
it's not only true of parents, it's true of those of us in the church who are representing God. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, God chose us for whatever reason, chose people like us to represent who God is. And if we're not doing that well,
Mm-hmm.
then I would want somebody to correct me and point out how I should change and be different.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I value that so much even in my friendships. Like I feel like I'm constantly asking my friends like, am I being an asshole? Like am I, where am I getting this wrong? And if they can't tell me, then I feel like I'm not in a real relationship, you know? Like in real relationship, we push, right? And we push each other to be better. Um and I think it's interesting too that really I don't even think that you were very critical in this book. I think you told the truth. You
Hmm.
told your experience. Now, your experience wasn't flattering, right?
Right.
And the net result of your experience was a lot of pain and hurt, but I thought that you were just very honest. And it's interesting to me too how there is this sort of there's a little bit of a rule in some church cultures that we shouldn't be honest, right? That even
Hmm.
just
Right.
sharing what happened isn't okay. And then we end up in this weird thing of like changing history, right? Or
Hmm.
like glossing over things that have really happened in the church, especially around race.
Right. Yes, you asked me earlier about how the writing of it was different. And I consider this book a kind of prequel to everything
Mm-hmm.
else. Most people, I've had 25 books out there over the
Mm-hmm.
years, and most of them are idea books.
Yeah.
I'm struggling to come to terms with, why bad things happen or
Mm-hmm.
what's so amazing about grace, who really is Jesus, these kind of foundational parts of our faith. But they're idea-driven books,
Mm-hmm.
and the difference with this book is that it's just telling the story.
Yeah.
And I had some brutal editors who would just say to me, "No, Philip, no more commentary,
Yeah.
no comments, no asides. You got to just tell
Yeah.
the story and let the reader put it together for
Yeah.
himself or herself."
Yeah.
And I tried hard to do that, and it was
Yeah.
it was actually a wonderful exercise. And later I thought, why did I spend so much time on those idea books? I should have been writing storybooks all this time.
Yeah, I really appreciated it. And I appreciated how honest you were about the experience of race in the church, because I feel like that is one that we really don't like to talk about. And
Right.
you talked about learning about the curse of Ham, and I had forgotten that I learned that too. I learned
Hmm.
that is exactly how that was explained to me. And just reading that was like, wow, like I washed over the fact that I was taught that, right? Like
Hmm.
I glossed over that, and I just It's interesting to me that we really don't want to talk about the racist roots of the church. That, I mean, some of us do, but I think and we're watching now. I'm watching a lot of evangelical Christians even fighting against this idea of critical race theory or ethnic studies. Like, we
Yes.
really want to not talk about our racist roots.
Hmm.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I've got to tell you, Kristen, I was afraid early on in my career to talk about that myself. I thought if I talk about being a racist growing up, then
Hmm.
all African Americans are going to hate me,
Yeah.
because it is ugly and it is
Yeah.
despicable. When you're a kid, you're taught this is the truth,
Yeah.
and you believe it. And I told racist jokes. I was on the wrong side. My
Hmm.
church actually called Martin Luther King Jr. They called him Martin Lucifer Coon from the pulpit. I mean, it was
Yeah.
wild, and we were taught this theory that from Ham on,
Hmm.
black people were cursed by
Hmm.
God, and they could be good servants,
Right.
but they could never really be masters. They
Hmm.
weren't capable of doing that. And if you're taught that by your pastor, by your church, people you respect, you just assume it's to be true. Then I went through that period where I realized the church was wrong.
Hmm.
Not only was it wrong, it had lied to me. And that was a huge crisis of faith, because if they lied to me about race,
Yeah.
what they said about the Bible, about
Yeah.
Jesus? Did they lie
Hmm.
to me about that as well? And I found out, actually, as I had some African American friends, I thought, just by being honest about my past, they would want to distance themselves. Well, I don't want to be
Hmm.
around one of those racists. They
Hmm.
were the least surprised of anybody.
Yeah.
They know.
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
and they were just grateful that somebody was trying to be honest about a
Right.
serious error. It's much like police brutality. You talk to African Americans today, and whites are shocked by what they're seeing, and the
Hmm.
African American community says, we knew this all along. It's just we didn't have
Absolutely.
we didn't have cell phones back then to video it. Now you get
Absolutely.
to see what we've always seen.
Yeah, absolutely. Your book reminded me of, I taught for about a decade. I taught in a grad psych program at a Christian university. One of the classes I taught was the psychology of diversity. And one of the first
Hmm.
assignments that I had every student do was I made them write a little mini autobiography of their experiences around race. And I asked them to think of everything that they learned, every message they heard,
Hmm.
when did you notice people were different races, and what messages did you get from your parents, and what messages did you get from your church? And it was always a really painful, for a lot of people, assignment to really put that all down, because we want to. And so I loved that you put it all down. You went through all of it. And I think that so many white people will relate to it. I mean, I related to so much of it. I remember this was in 1994, my sister was pregnant, and she was a teenager, and she wanted to get married at the church. And so they went to the church, and the church had a meeting about whether or not they'd perform the wedding. And it wasn't because she was pregnant, it was because they'd never done an interracial marriage, and
Oh my
her
goodness.
boyfriend
Oh
was
my
black.
goodness.
And so
Yeah.
the elders had a meeting about it. Now they performed the wedding, but just the fact that they met in the mid 90s, this was, I mean, 25 years ago, that they
Wow.
met to decide if they would do it, and um, just some of the extremes that you talked about in your own experience that just happened at the leadership level of the church, right? Not just like, okay, we had some racist members, but like right in the midst of the institution, things were happening.
And dial that back another 25 years,
Yeah.
which is the period when I
Right.
grew up.
Right.
And my church actually printed up cards, and I reproduce one in the book that says, they gave to any black people who tried to get into the church, saying, we know you're
Yeah.
not serious, you're just a troublemaker,
Right.
and all races are not equal. You're welcome to follow Jesus, but
Hmm.
not in our church.
Yeah.
I'm kind of paraphrasing that. And there was one person who was very devout. He was a student at a Bible college, Carver Bible College in Atlanta. And he liked our church. He liked the Bible teaching. And by then we were kind of allowing a few of them in if they sat in the back in one area by themselves. And he applied for membership. And we had another church meeting like that. And the decision was no, he was not allowed to join that church. His name was Tony Evans. He's now a mega church pastor in either Dallas or Houston. I think he's got 20,000 people in his church.
I was really curious when I was reading the book because you said his name, Tony Evans, and I was like, I wonder if that's the Tony Evans I know of. Yeah,
the very one. The very one. Yeah. And Tony got through it. Yeah. But think of some of his classmates who went through the same experience who probably just said, well, forget it.
Totally.
They don't want me, I don't want them, and just walked away from the faith. I mean, it's serious stuff we're dealing with when we take on a stance that is completely wrong and doesn't please God.
Yeah, and then it's, I think it's just as serious when we have that in our past and we don't acknowledge it and we want to move on and we want to, we don't want to make amends. We don't want to, we just don't want to talk about it. We want to brush it under the carpet. Like, let's move on. That sort of toxic, like, if we don't talk about racism, it's not really there.
Right.
I feel like I'm seeing that so much.
And there's a tendency, as you had alluded to earlier, to kind of whitewash, literally whitewash, and to propagandize. We don't want to talk about things because maybe that will turn people away from the church. But actually, I think we're in a different phase now. There are as many as 25 to 30 million ex-evangelicals, people who were raised in an evangelical type environment, who aren't in that now for whatever reason. Their attitude on gays or science or just, evolution, just not believing certain things that evangelicals believe. But many of those, and I know them, many of those have a nostalgia, a wistful nostalgia about some aspects, just truly believing that what we do on earth matters and how important love is and the idea that God actually does love us and forgive us. I mean, these are important concepts, but if you surround it with this trimming that goes in a different direction, you never get to the good news inside. Yeah. And so I think it's important to present the whole thing. And my life, I had a lot of reasons where I could have rejected my faith because it did come to me in an extreme form and not one that I could possibly swallow now. And I've been able to go back and try to figure out, I'll keep this part, but not this part. I'll keep this part and not. That's what I do in my books, in my writing. Yeah. And I wish for that group, there are some people who will never have a religious thought and don't want to, but for this group that still feels that wistfulness, that nostalgia, I hope you don't give up that process for yourself of sifting through. There are some things that you should reject and grow out of and progress beyond, but there are other things that you dare not let fall because you're not going to get them other places. So start with your faith base and do that. Richard Rohr, I don't know if you know that author, says we go through a pattern of order, disorder, reorder. The ordered era, in my case, was believing everything that my mother and the people around her and the church told her. This is the way the world is. Then I went through a period where I realized, no, it isn't. The world is very different. They were wrong about some things. And in teenage years and college years, we all do that. We form our own individuality. And then now I'm at the phase of trying to reorder it, to keep those things that are worth keeping, to let go of those things that aren't worth keeping. Yeah, absolutely.
One of the parts of your book I found really touching as well was that your brother kind of turned back to hymns, that's what he would play on the piano because that's what he remembered and knew. And, that's been such a touch point for me over the years. I grew up in a hymn singing church and, then went to college and decided I don't like any of this. I want to do the worship stuff. And then, as an adult came back to like singing hymns. And now we do these beer and hymns events where we have people come and, it's a safe space, and there are people who come for the nostalgia and they like singing these old songs, but maybe they
Right.
don't agree with them anymore. And there's people
Right.
who are coming because they, it's still very meaningful, and there's people all in between. And I kind of love how, there's still that good, right? Like we learned
Hmm.
these songs in our youth, and we might have been sitting in a fully racist church singing them, but there's still some like a line of beauty that carries through our life.
There is. Yeah. Yeah. Much like Jewish people singing Christmas carols or
Yeah.
going to see Handel's Messiah,
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah. Yeah.
and those things speak. Yeah. My brother, as the book tells, had a stroke and he
Mm-hmm.
has difficulty speaking.
Mm-hmm.
For a while, he couldn't say one word. But as it happens, music is stored in a different part of your brain than
Mm-hmm.
the part that his stroke affected. And so he could sing. He could
Mm-hmm.
still sing and still
Mm-hmm.
can. And I joked with him, Marshall, you're stuck. A lot of people
Mm-hmm.
have songs from the 60s stored away. All you've got
Yeah.
is hymns. So if you want to learn to talk, you better start singing those hymns again.
It's really funny. Yeah. There was a part in your book that I wanted to mention. You said this quote just really struck me. I begin to view church like family as a dysfunctional cluster of needy people.
Hmm.
I loved that.
Hmm.
I mean, that's a line of your whole book, but that just said it so
Yeah.
succinctly.
Well, you think about family.
Hmm.
I was present when a person stood up and said he was talking about the political divisions in our country today,
Yeah.
and he said to this group, "How many of you have a pretty close relative who voted in a way that you cannot possibly understand?"
Hmm.
Everybody in the room shot their hand up
Yeah.
from both sides, obviously.
Yeah.
And then he said, how many of you still have a relationship with that person that you're related to who voted in a way you cannot possibly understand? And almost everybody had their hand up.
Hmm.
There's something about family where we know
Hmm.
we can disagree. We can think
Yeah.
the other person is just stupid or crazy, but we're still family.
Hmm.
And when push comes to shove, when a crisis happens, when a need appears,
Yeah.
they're there for you. They
Yeah.
they may not want to be, but that's what family is.
Yeah.
And that's pretty close to what church is. We're called the brothers and sisters who were adopted into God's family.
Yeah.
And that identity should be more important to us than any other identity, certainly
Yeah.
more important than politics or tribe or even family. That's a connection that draws us together.
Yeah. And I think for me too, it's been helpful also just to remember that the church body we are humans. We're all a bunch of flawed
Mm.
humans. And so when the church body behaves in ways that are, hurtful and painful, that is our humanness coming out. It's not an indictment of like, well, I guess God isn't good, right? It's, we're still a collection of people that are behaving in our very
Right.
human ways, right? And so we don't throw out our faith because the church has been hurtful. We recognize that that's, the humanity getting in the way, getting in front of things.
Right. There's another quote. I thought you were going to turn to that actually. It came from a bottle cap. I have a nephew in Virginia, and there's some sort of juice out there, and they like a fortune cookie. They put some wise saying under the bottle cap, and people like to look at it and see what it said. And this particular one that he told me about said, "An idea cannot be held responsible for the people who believe in it."
Yeah.
And I immediately said, God cannot be held
Hmm.
responsible for the people who claim to believe in him.
Yeah.
To me, that's an astounding attribute of God, humility.
Yeah.
God could force us to behave, to believe in certain ways, but he never does. He backs off, gives us some evidence, not overwhelming evidence, and asks us to respond. God is humble by nature. And the church should also be,
Yeah.
even if we believe we have absolute truth
Yeah.
or something most important in the world, you're not going to convince people by cramming it down their throat, by propagandizing, by enforcing behavior. You're going to do it by the way God does, by drawing us, even seducing us.
Yeah.
The title of my book is Where the Light Fell. And that comes from a quote by St. Augustine, who said, I couldn't look at the sun directly. It was too bright, but I could look at places where the light fell. And I had been scorched by the sun, as it were, because I grew up in a Bible-saturated environment with my mother being a Bible teacher. And then this really conservative church we went to morning and night.
College.
We actually lived on the grounds in this little trailer. So I could never get away from the church. Then to a Bible college. There was nothing they could say that I hadn't heard before. And God didn't use those things. It wasn't a verse, a passage that brought me back to God. It was where the light fell. And the things I identify are nature and classical music and romantic love. Those three things. The more I experience them and soften them, the more I realize that this world is a lot different than the church had taught me. And God was not this scowling policeman in the sky trying to keep me from having a good time.
Right.
God is a magnificent artist who is giving away love, undeserved, just constant stream of love and forgiveness to people who don't deserve it.
And I mean, to me, that is such a beautiful and attractive message, right? Like, who doesn't feel drawn to the idea of love,
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and I think too, when we talk about the church and it, the church having been harmful and then wanting to like hide away the way we've been harmful, I know a lot of people who have come back to the church from Christians apologizing, right? Like, I think there's something really powerful in that of like, I remember seeing a couple of years ago, like, Christians giving out free hugs at a gay pride parade and saying we're sorry, right? And that being a really powerful moment for people. And I think that's true in a lot of racial reconciliation too. Is like when we own the pain we've caused, that's when the reconciliation happens. Like and I think that is attractive. That makes people feel safe with Christians who, maybe they felt harmed by before.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was in South Africa not long after things changed there. And of course, they were an openly racist society. It was in their constitution. It was just the way things were. And the Dutch Reformed Church was at the heart of it. It came up with the doctrine of apartheid. And when they formally renounced that, they did repent and apologize. And they thought that the Africans that they had misused would turn on them and, well, you've had your chance, now we got ours. And it didn't happen. They were touched by grace. That apology was the first step in breaking that chain of hatred that had gone back for 200 years in their case.
Yeah.
But it takes that honest admission of failure. And we white Christians in America have a lot to say to break that chain here.
Yeah, we do. And it's, it's disheartening to see that, it feels like there are some Christians who are, rather than pushing into that, pushing away, right? Like,
true.
We don't want to talk about race. We want to actively thwart those conversations. We want to, deny. And so I'm glad that people are speaking up. And I said this before, but I really did appreciate how bold you were in talking about this, as a white established Christian leader. Like, I think it's important. Your voice is important on this topic, I think.
Well, thank you. I'm not trying to make points in the book. I'm trying just to tell the story that happened.
You did. Yeah.
But the story feeds into everything I wrote since. So I call it a prequel. It was looking back to understand myself. Why did I keep talking about suffering? Why did I keep talking about grace? And these are the stories that form the person I am now.
There was another moment in the book And you talk about your reunion, and how your classmates were still talking in a lot of the phrases that talked we used in Bible college, and these are
Mm.
all so familiar to me. You know, that kind of, I call it Christianese. God is giving me the victory. I can do all things through Christ. All things work together for the good. I'm walking in triumph. So your classmates are using these phrases that, but then when they're talking about their actual lives, people are suffering from chronic pain and depression and, having issues, major issues with their kids. Talk to me about like our tendency to do that, right? Like we'll talk in this very, like Christianese, maybe even like toxic positivity around, our faith, but then our life and our experiences are very different, and what the disconnect is between those two.
Yes, I learned that so starkly from a church I attended in Chicago. It was a very grace-filled church, and we were asked by Alcoholics Anonymous, could they use our basement to meet? And a lot of churches are concerned about the carpet and all this stuff. And even though AA people shouldn't be drinking, they drink a lot of coffee and they
Yeah.
smoke a lot of cigarettes,
Yes,
even though
they
they're
do.
not supposed to. So many churches would turn them down to protect the sanctuary, the building. Well, our building wasn't the kind you'd want to spend much energy protecting. It was 150 years old. So we said, sure. And several times I went with a friend of mine to the basement church, the downstairs church. And if you've not been to AA, it's shocking how honest they are.
Yeah.
I mean, they can spot a lie a mile away, and you cannot get by with posing.
Yeah.
Your ticket is total honesty.
Yep.
If you can't be honest, they can't help you, and they don't want you around. And so they were so honest about what their lives were like, what a mess this last week was.
Yeah.
And then I'd go upstairs. How are you, Mrs. Smith? Oh, just fine. How are you? And I knew that actually her marriage was about to fall apart, and one of her kids was using drugs, things. But in church, in the upstairs church, they felt like we had to put on a good face,
Yeah.
And I realized, boy, that limits you. I asked my alcoholic friend in the downstairs church, he's a Christian. Did you ever think about going to the upstairs church? Oh, I'd never go there. Well, why not? Well, they dress so nice, and they have jobs, and they show up on time. And he said, I'm never anywhere on time. And when a couple times I've gone to church and I'll be 10, 15 minutes late, and they all turn around and scowl at me, why can't you be responsible like us? And that is something that often Christians communicate. We're morally superior.
Yeah.
Our behavior is better. So we're better off. And just go back and look at who Jesus held up as the good example. It wasn't the Pharisee saying, I'm not like that tax collector over there, that sinner. It was the sinner who's the hero. It wasn't the good brother who did everything he was supposed to do. No, it was the prodigal brother. These are the ones that Jesus can deal with. It was Henry Nouwen who said, grace is a free gift. It comes completely free from God. There's nothing you can do to earn it, to deserve it by definition. But to receive a gift, you have to have your hands open. And so often religious types, Christians, have their hands kind of closed tight. I'm doing just fine, thank you.
Yeah.
I don't need your help,
Yeah.
Whereas people who are really needy and admit it,
Yeah.
have their hands open, saying, I don't know what this grace looks like, but I know I need something. Please, please.
Yeah.
I want to have it. And if we had those open hands every time we went to a worship service, that would just change the tenor so much.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny that you brought up AA, because I've even said that before. I'm not in recovery, but I've worked in, as a therapist, I've worked in the recovery field and have many friends in recovery. And I actually find people who are in recovery to be really safe for me, because they are so vulnerable. They're very honest. And, my life experiences have brought me to a place where I really want honesty, right? Like, I don't want to walk into a room of people using Christian phrases. That doesn't feel safe to me anymore. I'd rather walk into a mess. I'd rather walk into a room of people just laying it out.
And as a therapist, you'd be out of business in one day if people
Yeah.
weren't honest. It's like,
Yeah.
why are you coming to me?
Yeah.
Tell me the real truth. Otherwise, I can't help you at
Absolutely.
all. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But I had a similar experience. I remember I was in MOPS, which is, mothers of preschoolers,
Sure.
and we'd
Right.
we'd meet a couple times a week, and our kids would, get free childcare, and we would have like a Bible study. But I can just remember we'd go around the room and share, and I remember sitting at a table with women talking about, my walk is good and I'm having my Bible studies. And I'm like, okay, I know that your kids is going through an autism diagnosis and your husband has a brain tumor and your marriage, you left your husband the other night and his husband called mine and was wondering where you were, like, and yet we're just not getting into it, right? Like we're not talking about
Yeah.
this stuff. And I
Yeah.
remember just feeling so frustrated, like, well, why can't we talk about the real stuff that's happening? But we're all putting on our good Christian show, I guess.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Which, and again, just leading back to that idea of just honesty, I think is very refreshing. Like, I think, if as Christians we can be more honest, I think it's relieving to people. And I mean, your writing, I think, for me, has always been that. Like you're asking hard questions that I want to ask that I didn't feel safe
Mhm.
to ask, and you're asking them in a book, and I just, it's attractive and it's healing to have people
Hmm.
asking honest questions and saying honest things.
Well, good. I wanted to kind of capture my subculture.
Yeah,
I know not everyone went through the kind of experiences I went through, but there was a subculture going on in the 50s and 60s, especially in the South, that kind of Christian subculture
yeah,
that was a moment in time that
yeah,
may not be repeated. And I wanted to capture it because I was right in the middle of it, at the heart
yeah,
of it. There are a lot of books out there on people who have gone through that and rejected it and mock and make fun of it. You can go on a
sure.
website called Fundamentalists Anonymous and hear
Mm-hmm.
these horror stories about how terrible fundamentalists are.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I read these stories and I laugh and I say, "Hey, my church was worse than yours. What are you complaining about?" But the difference is, through God's grace, I did emerge and didn't reject it. I did for a period of time, but not
Mm-hmm.
finally. And there is a redemptive thread that God can
Yeah.
use even the distortions in God's own name
Mm-hmm.
in a redemptive way.
Yeah.
And so I've waited a long time to tell my story because now I have a platform
Mm-hmm.
after years of 50 years of writing practically. I
Yeah.
have a platform of who I am and what I believe. And I want to go back and explain where that came from, both to keep from sliding off the
Mm-hmm.
rails at various points, but to emphasize that there is something worth pursuing,
Yeah.
worth more than anything else in life worth pursuing, actually.
Yeah. Well, I appreciated it so much. This is your book, Where the Light Fell. And when's your launch date? When does it go on sale?
October 5.
Okay. Awesome. Awesome.
Right.
Well, I really appreciate you talking with me. I loved this book very much. I read it really fast, which is a sign for me that I'm invested. I think I read it in about 2 days. But
Okay.
I related to it so much and just really appreciated it.
Good.
Thank
Well, it's
you.
been great to be with you and reflect. Thank you so much for the time, Kristen.
Thank you.